Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a presentation that really doesn't pull any punches. It argues that what we're seeing play out isn't just, ordinary unrest or protest, but something far more structured and dangerous.
That's right. This deep dive is based on a presentation by Lev Neymotin, PhD. It's titled Insurgency Revisited from the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the Southern Border. And it lays out a very, very specific and strongly held perspective on current events.
And right from the start, it's absolutely crucial to make this crystal clear to you, the listener. The positions, the views expressed in this presentation, they are entirely those of Lev Neymotin.
Exactly. He's a specialist in national security, and our mission today is simply to explore his specific arguments, his analysis, just as he presented them in his work.
We're not here to debate the claims, not endorsing them, just trying to understand what he is arguing.
Precisely. Our goal is to unpack his core argument, look at the key terms he introduces, and he does introduce some key terms, dive into the historical parallels he draws, and, see how he connects all these different pieces together.
Okay, so let's start right there with that central thesis. What is the fundamental claim Neymotin is making about what he sees happening across the United States?
Well, his core argument is pretty stark. He asserts that the events unfolding aren't just spontaneous protests or civil unrest. He explicitly labels them a violent and coordinated insurgency.
Insurgency. That's a really heavy term.
Yeah.
What does he mean by calling it that, beyond just, violence?
He means it's not random. According to Neymotin, this is something ideologically driven, meticulously funded, and strategically deployed. That's his view.
Okay, so coordinated, strategic, funded.
Yes, and a key part of his thesis is his assertion that this is being allowed, if not actively shielded, by a political class. A political class he seems to view as too timid, too compromised, or too ideologically aligned to stop it.
So enabled internally, too, in his view. He argues that to really get the full scope, we need to identify the ideology behind it, and the foreign power he believes is, exporting it? Where does he point?
Right. He makes the case that this isn't, quote, homegrown chaos. In his view, it's the byproduct of a foreign-born ideology that, as he puts it, has wormed its way into our domestic bloodstream.
And he actually introduces a specific term for this ideology, doesn't he? It seems pretty central to his argument in Section 1.
He does, yeah. He introduces and defines a term he calls Islamonism. This is a key concept that he brings into this discussion. It seems specific to his analysis here.
Okay, tell us about his definition then. How does he frame Islamism?
Neymotin defined Islamism as the transformation, or more accurately, the metastasizing of Islam from a personal faith into a brutal totalitarian ideology.
Metastasizing, that's a really strong word, like cancer spreading.
It is, and that language definitely reflects how he views this ideology. He emphasizes what he sees as a critical characteristic. He claims it glorifies the killing of opponents and non-believers.
Glorifies killing.
That's his claim. He draws a very provocative comparison here, stating that, like communism in its heyday, it views killing not as collateral damage, but as a sacred tool of ideological enforcement.
Wow. Okay, that's a very specific and intense way he's defining an ideology. And who does he identify as the primary driver, the sort of engine behind this, according to his presentation?
According to Neymotin's presentation, the world's #1 exporter of Islamism is Iran.
Iran. So he sees Iran as the central orchestrator of this whole thing.
Yes, he argues Iran isn't just some passive sponsor, but is actively orchestrating what he describes. He lists the methods he believes they use: funding, training, propagandizing, and infiltrating. That's his list.
And how does he claim they're able to pull this off, within the U.S. system?
Yeah.
What makes the U.S. vulnerable in his eyes?
He argues they exploit, as he puts it, every available crack in the American system. He specifically lists things he sees as vulnerabilities, like open media, political tribalism, and fractured identity.
Political tribalism, fractured identity. He seems to mean our internal divisions.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Deep partisan splits, social fragmentation, these are the kinds of cracks he suggests are being exploited.
And he highlights one specific vulnerability as being maybe exploited above all others.
Oh, absolutely. He places immense emphasis on what he calls our suicidal refusal to defend our own borders. He argues this failure, as he sees it, to secure the border is the main vulnerability that Iran is actively exploiting in this alleged insurgency.
He also mentions other nations in the region, doesn't he? In the Middle East?
He does, yeah. He's quite critical of other Islamic nations, stating that many chose not to confront this cancer, as he puts it. He even claimed some, despite their wealth, actually bankrolled it.
But he does offer a little bit of hope, a potential positive shift he sees.
Yes, just a flicker, as he calls it. He identifies what he calls a flicker of hope in the Trump era push for economic ties with some key Arab states.
Ah, the Abraham Accords era logic.
Right. He suggests this could signal a potential shift away from the dogma of Islamonism to the logic of capitalism, basically moving from ideology to prosperity. In his view, if that shift continued, it could isolate Iran, which he clearly sees as a good thing.
Okay, so Section 1 of his presentation really lays out his view of the ideological engine, what he calls Islamonism, and the foreign state actor he blames Iran. Then he shifts gears in Section 2, using history to draw parallels to today.
Correct. He argues that to really understand the insurgency he's describing, we have to look back specifically to the Vietnam War era. And he states the parallels he finds are, quote, chilling.
All right, let's dig into those parallels he draws. What's the first big one he pulls from Vietnam?
The first parallel is the whole idea of a foreign-backed insurgency. He lays out the Vietnam context as he sees it. The Viet Cong weren't just, a purely internal force. He states they were fueled, trained, and equipped by the USSR and China.
Making it a proxy war in his analysis.
Exactly. In his view, it wasn't just a civil war. It was fundamentally a proxy war.
And he directly compares that specific historical situation to what he claims is happening now inside the U.S.
Yes, he draws a very, very direct line. He argues that today the radical mobs, violent agitators, and ideological thugs, his words that he observes, are not acting alone. He claims they are empowered and emboldened by Tehran.
So in his framework, Iran is playing the role that Moscow and Beijing played back then.
Precisely. He states it very bluntly. Iran is today what Moscow and Beijing were in the 1960s, the foreign puppet master of chaos.
Wow.
Yeah. He does acknowledge that the specific tools may be different. He lists things like social media, activist networks, and what he calls NGO laundering, which sounds like funneling money through nonprofits. But he insists the core principle is the same.
That's a really powerful and, I imagine for many people, a very controversial comparison to make. What's the second parallel he draws? This one ties back to logistics, the border issue he raised earlier.
Right. The second parallel is all about logistics and access, the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the southern border. He describes the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam as this kind of shadow lifeline running through Laos and Cambodia, used to funnel arms and troops into the south.
A lifeline the U.S. tried to cut.
Exactly. He points out the U.S. military knew about it, bombed it, tried to disrupt it, but ultimately failed to seal it. And his conclusion from that history is stark. This failure cost us the war.
And he argues there's a version of that critical supply line today.
Yes, he states that today's trail isn't overseas in some jungle. It runs through our own southern border. This is the second key parallel he introduces in his presentation.
And this is where his argument about the border gets particularly pointed, right?
It really does. He makes this highly provocative claim that unlike Vietnam, where the U.S. at least tried and failed to seal the trail, today, regarding our southern border, quote, we don't even try to seal it. We leave it open. We debate it. We virtue signal over it. That's his assessment.
And he actually gives the southern border the new name in his presentation. A very loaded name, linking it straight back to Iran from Section 1.
Yes, he does. He controversially renames the southern border the Ayatollah Khomeini Trail. It's a very strong rhetorical move, clearly meant to shock and emphasize his point about Iran's alleged influence.
And what does he argue is being funneled through this modern trail, according to his analysis?
In his presentation, he claims this channel is used not just for migrants, but for cartel weapons, fentanyl, ideological agents, and insurgents. He goes on to add the dramatic phrase that these are, quote, marching into our heartland with a wink from Washington.
So he's really hammering the difference between the historical failure he described in Vietnam and the current situation as he sees it.
Absolutely. He repeats that distinction for emphasis. In Vietnam, we tried and failed. Here, we're not even trying. For him, this point underscores just how severe he believes the current situation is.
Okay, so we've got the engine Islamonism, allegedly exported by Iran. We've got the parallels, the foreign-backed proxy war dynamic like Vietnam, and the southern border as a modern Ayatollah Khomeini trail. How does Neymotin actually connect all these pieces? How does he weave them together to build his overall argument that this is a coordinated insurgency?
Well, he connects them by arguing that the core components he identifies fit a recognizable pattern for insurgency. The initial description of events as an insurgency is defined by what he identifies as its foreign ideological backing.
Which he pins on Islamism coming from Iran. That's section 1.
Exactly. And he argues this foreign backing then leverages open entry channels.
Which he directly links to the southern border in section 2, calling it the modern trail.
Right. So you have the foreign ideology and support structure using an open pathway.
And this foreign element, in his view, works together with internal problems.
Precisely. He argues it's all enabled and exploited because of existing internal destabilization. He points to things like social fragmentation, the violent mobs he mentions, political paralysis, and crucially, in his view, a political class that is either paralyzed or, worse, complicit.
So it's this combination: foreign actor, open channel, internal weakness, political inaction. That's his recipe for insurgency.
That seems to be his argument. This combination of foreign orchestration using open channels, exploiting internal fragility, he claims, echoes that foreign proxy war dynamic he highlighted in the first Vietnam parallel. He presents these elements, foreign ideology, strategic funding training, open borders, internal division, as the building blocks of the specific type of insurgency he believes is unfolding now.
Which brings us back full circle to his really strong insistence in the conclusion of his presentation. We have to call it what it is.
Right. He hammers that point home. He returns to his thesis, arguing forcefully that the situation shouldn't be mislabeled as just protest or rioting. He insists it must be recognized as an insurgency.
Let's just quickly recap the key elements he argues define this insurgency as we've walked through them from his presentation.
Okay, based on his presentation, it's 1, foreign ideological backing, specifically Iran and what he terms Islamism. 2, internal destabilization, meaning social fragmentation, violent actors, political paralysis. 3, open entry channels, which he identifies as the southern border. And 4, a political class he sees as too paralyzed by infighting, or worse, complicit to respond.
And he wraps it all up with a really potent warning, doesn't he? Directly linking back to that Vietnam parallel he drew.
He does. He uses the lesson he extracted from Vietnam, where he claims the U.S. failed to understand the threat until it was too late, which led to defeat, and applies that exact warning to the situation he's describing today.
And that leads directly into the stark, final sentence of his presentation. It certainly leaves you with a significant thought to consider, as presented by Lev Neymotin.
It definitely frames the stakes in a very specific and challenging way, according to his perspective.
So this deep dive has really explored one specific, very strongly held perspective on current events. We focused on the definition of Islamonism, as introduced by Lev Neymotin, the role he attributes to Iran, and those striking historical parallels he draws from Vietnam, particularly around foreign backing and those contested supply lines.
Yeah, it's a viewpoint that uses incredibly powerful language, controversial comparisons, to frame some really complex issues in a very particular way, and again, authored by someone presented as a specialist in national security.
It provides a clear framework for understanding his argument, even if, as you said, the claims themselves are deeply contentious.
Exactly. It's about understanding the argument presented.
Indeed. And with that, we'll leave you with Lev Neymotin's final, concluding thought from the source material we explored today. If we repeat that mistake now, if we refuse to call this insurgency by its name, we won't just lose a war in someone else's country. We will lose our own.